Hello and good evening. You're joining us now for a conversation from Tortoise for one of our think-ins. And the starting point for this is 8 Years Hard Labour, which was a podcast series which we released at the end of last year. And it's the inside story of two revolutions inside the Labour Party from 2015 up until the present day. So it covers the period of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and then Keir Starmer's leadership up till now. And joining us to talk about that are David Aronovich, who some of you will know as a journalist and commentator, but also as who reported and hosted the podcast series, and also Tortoise's political editor, Kat Neelan, who also was involved in reporting and hosting the series. I think, David, probably my first question goes to you. I think one of the things, obviously, that's striking is for somebody with a career like yours, you've seen two leftist sort of takeovers of the Labour Party, first in the 1980s under the sort of Bennites at the time, then obviously after 2015 and Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. How do you think they differed, and to what extent were they the same?
Yeah, it's a really fun question for me, even if it's a question that requires some tolerance from younger listeners and viewers. When I was first became a journalist, it was just after the Falklands War had finished. Labour had been defeated in the 1979 election. Thatcher was going to be facing re-election within a year. And Labour was just coming through a period of absolute maximum faction fighting. This had culminated in the battle for the deputy leadership of the Labour Party in 1981 between the then deputy leader and moderate Dennis Healey, who stood for, amongst other things, for belonging to NATO. He was an Atlanticist and so on, and Tony Benn, who had become the major figure for the left and the far left within the Labour Party, and standing for a whole set of changes within the Labour Party, such as, and we won't go into too far, things like mandatory reselection, whereby all MPs would be subject to constant recall by their constituency Labour parties, and so on. This came out of a whole series of struggles which had happened in the 70s within the Labour Party. And at that point, and going into the 83 election, it was incredibly finely poised. Labour went into the 1983 election with what was called the longest suicide note in history by one of the Labour MPs, etc., was absolutely massacred by Mrs. Thatcher in her second election of 1983. And then began what you might call the fight back with the election of Neil Kinnock as the leader of the Labour Party just after 1983, coming from the left. Those battles were very, very big in my early period of journalism. We used to go off and talk to Labour. I worked on a program called Weekend World, which was made by ITV. And we would go off and interview left-wingers in the constituencies who wanted total change, and then people who were called right-wingers and so on. And of course, we had at that period also the split off into the Social Democratic Party. And so, it was a fully fledged split off. And then there was the business of Kinnock fighting the Labour Party. So it was extraordinary after those incredible set of battles which had happened during the early to mid 80s, which had then very slowly been resolved in favour of what you might call loosely call a moderate Labour Party. It was absolutely extraordinary in the wake of Labour's defeat in 2015, when under Ed Miliband, to see the party elect someone who was even more left-wing than Tony Benn had been, and not to the deputy leadership, but to the leadership, and then to see the entire party taken over by essentially those sort of people. And the other funny thing for me personally was that some of the people who came back in with Jeremy Corbyn were exactly the same people a few years later, though, who I'd seen effectively chucked out or sort of sent to the margins under Neil Kinnock when the left was defeated. So it had this kind of lovely sort of symmetry to it.
Yeah. Kat, how much of that story of the Corbyn era story was familiar to you as a political reporter?
The sort of broad outlines of it, but I think for me the kind of more interesting sort of, or not more interesting, but more sort of resonant figures within Corbyn's team were the people who had been sort of on the fringes, I suppose, of Labour in under Tony Blair, and the Iraq War had really had such a strong impact on them, and that seemed to take them on this route on the left of the party and its outer fringes, and of course would then play such a kind of pivotal role when it came to the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, which I think we'll get onto later. Yeah. But that seemed to be, at that point, I realised how instrumental and fundamental the Iraq War was in shaping the views of a lot of people around Corbyn at that time.
Yeah. One of the things that becomes apparent in the series and from your reporting quite quickly is that Jeremy Corbyn and the people immediately around him simply weren't ready or very well prepared for whatever reason for that job. I mean, it's the job of opposition leader is the worst job in politics as it's known, but they really struggled, didn't
they? This was part of the kind of mystery for me as somebody who'd known of Jeremy Corbyn since the 70s, which was to see people projecting a kind of competence onto him that he'd never exhibited in 40 years. He wasn't interested in detail. He and Boris Johnson are the two least detail interested people we've ever had at the head of British political parties. When we went in the 2019 election, I wrote that for the first time ever, I think I could honestly say that I thought I would make a better prime minister than either of the two major candidates, and I would make a terrible prime minister. Partly because of this kind of incapacity to deal with things. He was fundamentally a protest figure. There were one or two people around him who'd done things. John McDonnell is a key figure here, who had been number 2 to Ken Livingstone back when they both ran the Greater London Council. And for those of people who don't know what that is, a quick Google is in order. This also takes you back into the kind of mists of the 1980s, because it was abolished by Margaret Thatcher, and then the London Authority brought back, and the mayor brought back by Tony Blair. So there were one or two people who could do this, and one or two of the people associated with them actually did make kind of halfway competent people on the edges of Corbyn's office. But by and large, they've done nothing. They were people who'd never had a position of authority. They'd been absolutely on the margins of protest politics for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, there they were in this sort of pressure cooker atmosphere. And Kat in particular talked to a lot of them, because a lot of them were more reluctant to talk to me. I had more success, if you like, with the older Bennites who I'd known for some time, and some of the older socialists and so on. And it's quite interesting for those who want to listen back to the series and kind of see it through that kind of dimension. A lot of those really great interviews with the people from Corbyn's office were the ones that Kat did. And I was struck by how they more or less all kind of, a lot of them said the same thing, which was, it wasn't fair. There was all that work to do and all that pressure. Who knew? Yeah. And kind of, and you thought, yeah, that's sort of what it's been about all those years, you know?
And Kat, there are sort of two interesting characters sort of emerge quite quickly. One is Keir Starmer, who was first elected in 2015. He's come from running the CPS. He's a knight. He was Sir Keir Starmer by then. And then the other figure sort of looming in the background is Len McCluskey in Unite. What can you say about, because you've sort of got this trajectory of Corbyn's leadership, Starmer becomes an MP, he becomes, I think, shadow immigration minister quite quickly, doesn't he? So he makes a decision to join the Corbyn project.
Yes, yes. So he was one of the more prominent members of the new intake in 2015. Obviously, not a huge intake for Labour, but because he was the former director of public prosecutions, and as you say, a knight, he had a certain status, and so I think people gravitated to him. Labour MPs, particularly younger, newer Labour MPs, kind of gravitated towards him. As you say, he kind of quickly got onto the first rungs of the ladder. He resigned during the sort of first leadership challenge that Corbyn faced very quickly after he had become leader, which was known as the chicken coup.
This is when Owen Smith was put as the sort of stalking horse candidate, really.
Exactly. So I think Owen Smith, we didn't actually manage to speak to him, but from the people we did speak to, it sounded as though Owen Smith kind of became the alternative leadership candidate by default, because I think there was a combination of a lot of people not willing to put their necks out on the line at that point, and well, I think that was basically it, really. He ran, but I think partly or primarily perhaps because the leadership contest had come so quickly after Corbyn had been elected. The Labour membership felt very strongly that that was unfair, and that you know, the MPs were trying to sort of block their choice, I suppose. So he was re-elected with, I think, a larger majority than he had before, and during that time, we're told, and again, as you will hear if you've listened to the podcast, it's an on-record statement from Andrew Fisher, who was working very closely with Corbyn at that time, that even before the leadership contest had finished, Keir Starmer was already speaking to Corbyn and people in Corbyn's team about a role in his cabinet, which would be a promotion. And again, a very large jump up, considering that by this point, he'd only been in Parliament for a year or less than a year. So he became Shadow Brexit Secretary. And that was really his springboard to becoming a sort of household name. Obviously, Brexit being the issue, albeit not necessarily seen as such by Corbyn's office at that point, but the dominant issue of those 3 or 4 years. And so there was a lot of time when he was at the dispatch box probing David Davis, who was the government counterpart on the negotiations, really kind of playing to his strengths as a former prosecutor. And then on the flip side, you have Len McCluskey, which I think David's probably better placed to talk more about.
Boss of Unite.
Pardon?
The boss of Unite, Len McCluskey.
The boss of Unite. Yeah. And slightly to the point that you are sort of making about the inexperience of a lot of the people around Corbyn, they effectively came in and started to run the office almost as an outpost of Unite.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on one thing, because I think there's something really interesting at the heart of this, which is that Keir Starmer made the decision, and it's sort of trying to understand this decision. In a way, does it help us understand Starmer as a politician? Perhaps it's a question, David, for you. His decision to serve under Corbyn, because obviously he decides in a year after becoming an MP, he decides actually Corbyn's not up to it. He votes in the no confidence vote against Corbyn. Then he rejoins and stays in the cabinet, shadow cabinet, from there right until the end, all the way through various crises that we'll come to. Lots of other sort of senior Labour figures, Yvette Cooper, others, decided to stay out of that. They didn't take front bench jobs. What do you think it tells us, David, perhaps about Starmer?
Well, the first thing is to say that Starmer also belongs to a section of the party that thought that Brexit was really important. And that the kind of Brexit that Britain ended up with, if any at all, because part of the problem with Brexit, and we shan't kind of rehearse the whole damn thing, but was it was a yes/no vote. It wasn't a vote for what it was going to be. So the whole then huge fandango that followed was what it was actually going to consist of. And of course, Remainers had as much interest in the question of what that would be as Leavers did, but had to fight, if you like, for some kind of recognition. And Starmer was the voice of that fight. So in the one level, at the kind of idealistic level, Brexit is important, and you've got to kind of represent it. And where you're going to do it from? Well, possibly the best place to kind of influence what happens that from, if you're a Labour Party person, is if you're the shadow Brexit secretary. It also becomes relatively clear. So that's all beginning in 2016. Then, if you remember, you have Theresa May effectively collapses.
Mm.
She can't get her settlement through. She's got a very small majority. She decides to go to the country. Um, uh, she thinks at the point she goes to the country that Corbyn's going to get massacred because that's what the polls show, that's what the local elections have just shown, and bingo, he doesn't get massacred. And all of a sudden, she hasn't got a majority at all, and everything's to play for.
Mm.
And
I think
so,
that came as a surprise to Corbyn's team as well,
yeah,
because
How well they did, yeah.
yeah, because at the start of that campaign, her polling was extremely good. Andrew Fisher told us that they couldn't find any gaps in it at all, and so the
Andrew
Tory
Fisher was
party,
an inner sanctum Corbyn
he
advisor.
was, yes, he was the sort of one of the top three members in Corbyn's team,
Mm.
and so the Conservatives ran a presidential type campaign around Theresa May, and the kind of Brexit means Brexit, strong and stable, and it just totally, as David says, just collapsed, and she ended up with a minority government having to do a confidence and supply deal with the DUP, which obviously hampered what she was able to do in terms of negotiations with Brexit, because they had a particular view about the type of Brexit they wanted. But Corbyn's team then, I think, relied, or sort of perhaps having been so surprised at their success, and so surprised that they were sort of filling out all these kind of stadiums with supporters, and sort of halls with supporters, that it kind of went to their head. And instead of thinking, look, we lost, but it was closer than we thought, how can we sort of close that difference and win next time, they very much, as we all probably remember, kind of went, well, we won the argument, and
Yeah,
acted as though they had won it,
yeah.
and sort of rested on their laurels, and didn't then maintain the momentum.
And
yes,
there was a sort of
absolutely.
high point at Glastonbury that year, wasn't
Yeah.
there? Which, in fact, I mean, some people in, I think, John McDonnell's office didn't think was a terribly good thing.
One of those kind of divisions, actually, that we were just talking about now, the sort of younger people who've been associated with Corbyn thought this is absolutely wonderful. We've won the argument and Glastonbury is great. And the old grizzled ones who mostly spoke to me said, oh, that was terrible. That was awful. And so it was all kind of, it was hubristic, and it boded no good. The important point about this is that whatever the Corbynites were thinking at this point, the fact was that we were still in the middle of a Brexit crisis, which had to be resolved. This was increasingly the critical issue. And Keir Starmer was the man who, for Labour Party, was gripping it. And not only was he gripping it, but he also better represented the views of actual Labour members about what should happen with Brexit than Jeremy Corbyn did, who'd never really liked the European. He'd voted against in 1975. He'd been a Benite. Tony Benn had always been opposed to Britain's membership of the EEC and EU, and so on. So at best, had been completely ambivalent about it. And Labour members forgave him this in 2016 and so on. But after 2017, there had to be a decision made, and Starmer was the guy who was making it. And then right into the middle of this happening comes the series of things that you alluded to earlier, which were, if you like, the old Adam of Corbynism outing itself. And outing itself in two specific areas. One in the area of British security and defence over the Salisbury poisoning, and the second one over the anti-Semitism crisis. And the fact that they both happened in the same year means that you go into 2018 with kind of Corbynism on a high, and you come out of 2018 with Starmer on a high, seen in retrospect, because he's the guy who gets the standing ovation for his speech at the Labour Party conference in 2018, a speech which the Corbyn people didn't want him to make in those terms.
Let's just take some of those piece by piece, David, if that's all right with you. Let's do the anti-Semitism stuff, because that was I mean, it was just I think in the reporting of this series, it was sort of jaw-dropping in the detail of it, I think, sometimes, and how it happened. I mean, how do you think it kind of got back into the party in that way?
Well, I feel a set of very complex feelings about this, actually, which in the end you could probably do your own series about in a kind of slightly different way. But essentially, Jeremy Corbyn came from the anti-imperialist tradition of the left, which tends to be a kind of rather anti-Western tradition. We're responsible for the ills of the world. We've imposed colonialism, imperialism upon everybody else. That's the major issue, not what the Russians are doing, not what the Chinese are up to. It's our governments that tend to be uniquely bad. And if only we can get defeated everywhere, then the world will be a better place,
Yeah.
essentially. And it's a very particular kind of thing, and it's a start. It's what had Jeremy being a big member of Jeremy Corbyn being up the Cuba Solidarity Committee and bigging up the Castros as if they were some kind of set of Democrats, when in fact they were a series of dynastic autocrats. It's just that they were left-wing dynastic autocrats and so on. So it's a series of blind spots and affiliations which aren't immediately obvious. They were raised a bit, our friends in Hamas, our friends in Hezbollah, all these kind of places and meetings he'd been to for years and years and years and years, not made that enough of probably during the 2015 leadership election, skirted over, etc., but really come to the fore in the Skripal thing, and then really come to the fore again in the question of anti-Semitism, which is mostly about the question of tends to be around the question of Israel. Israel seen as yet another colonialist power, kind of expression of the worst of the West, terribly doing terrible things to the Palestinians and so on. And a significant section of that bit of the left actually thought that having a state of Israel at all was a mistake. You can't have that kind of state in a world like ours, etc. You need one state from the river to the sea, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
and so on. Now, when that is thwarted, people begin to talk very easily about the Zionist lobby and why it is policy doesn't go in that direction and who's got the power and these lobbies using their money and power to influence politics. And these to the Jewish community are incredibly redolent of the sorts of anti-Semitic stereotypes which were constructed before Israel was even invented. In fact, there were some of the stereotypes that were constructed that led to Israel being invented so that people could go there to escape them and so on. And it's the blindness at best of the Corbynites to what that actually means and then to some developments from it. There were some shocking, absolutely shocking instances of Labour local council candidates and so on, involved in things like Holocaust denial and so on, and then senior Labour figures associated with Corbyn attempting to get them exculpated. And for those who are not clear, what exculpated means is made innocent rather than made guilty, etc., by the disciplinary processes. And so when we looked at it, I mean, some of it was in the public domain, some of it wasn't. But what was really striking was the level of just incapacity. I mean, it's a little bit, I think the Corbynites in this sense were a bit like the post office with the sub postmasters in a funny kind of way, utterly unable to see what was going on, take it seriously, and see that a pattern had been developing which they needed urgently to deal with. As we know, the result was a catastrophe for them.
I think one of the interesting things, Kat, in the series is the way Luciana Berger, who was an MP, is it in Liverpool, I think, who ended up leaving the party. I'm going to get my history wrong here, probably, but I think before the 2019 election, I'm not sure she stood in the 2019 election. I think she
she did. She did. She stood for the
Lib Dems. But maybe was it for the Independent Party?
Change, yeah.
Yeah. But her account of what it was like to be Jewish and a Labour MP at the time, I think, is really striking and shocking that such open racism was so present in mainstream politics in Britain.
Yeah, so I think it makes for quite a hard listen, actually. And it's also kind of, I don't know, interesting, maybe not that surprising, that a lot of it was directed towards women, female Jewish members and MPs. So I don't think it's any coincidence that, it wasn't just Luciana that quit. Ruth Smith was handed out as well. Louise Ellman.
Yeah.
And I think Ruth Smith, of course, she was famously sort of brought to tears at a press conference because where she was, accused of being part of this sort of Zionist lobby that David mentioned, and of passing information to right wing newspapers, which she obviously denied. But yeah, I mean, I think it's got to, look, Keir Starmer clearly realised, I think on a sort of principled level, but also no doubt on a sort of pragmatic political level as well, that one of the first things that he had to do was to sort this out. And just this week, I think, or late last week, he spoke at a Jewish Labour group, and again referred to Luciana, Ruth, and Louise. I think they were there, and their sort of acknowledgement, approval, acceptance of the work that he has done, I think, is so important for Starmer's ability to actually demonstrate that he has done a lot of work in kind of this clearing this out of the party. Of course, the sort of, you think of the sort of totemic individuals within the party, Corbyn being the most obvious one, but it was insidious, and it was all the way through the party, right down to the grassroots. And of course, we reported on the situation where there was the Palestinian flags that had been given out at one of the party conferences, and Emily Thornberry was giving a speech, some of the sources that we spoke to believe that it was sort of deliberately kind of created to be made as hostile as possible an environment for her, in which to give, I think it was a speech talking about the two-state solution. Yes, I think it was a very dark period for the party, and not just for Jewish members as well. We spoke to Wes Streeting, who is not Jewish, and he recalled quite sort of deeply that the feelings that it provoked in him, how unpleasant he found the whole thing.
Yeah. And David, I think you interviewed Margaret Hodge, didn't you, for the series? She obviously the MP for Barking and Dagenham. You probably reported on her when she was running Islington Council back in the 1980s or something like that. But the point was, she was the most publicly vocal combatant, if you like, willing to take on Corbyn. She felt very strongly that was the problem lay right at the top of the.
Well, she took it straight. She famously took it straight to him in an almost physical confrontation in the House of Commons, just off the House of Commons chamber, when she called him a racist, an anti-Semitic racist. And this comment was then put out there by a couple of obliging colleagues of hers who had been told about it. And at that point, she was requested that she should apologise or be disciplined by the party. She refused to apologise, but they discovered, the Corbynites, that they weren't in a position to discipline her, essentially. Yeah. So they kind of created yet another rod for her own back. And of course, if you get somebody as senior as Margaret Hodge, who has no further expectation of ministerial office, etc., and essentially is left just with her conscience to deal with, etc. That's a very dangerous kind of backbencher for anybody to have to deal with, because they will say exactly what they think and in no uncertain terms. So this did indeed become very public. But it's worth saying that at this point, there were lots of other non-Jewish MPs, you could call them centrist, you could call them moderate, but others as well, who are now very active on this question by this stage.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things that Luciana Berger recalls is when there was this famous Enough is Enough demonstration by the Jewish community, which Kat actually saw and was present for outside Parliament, a number of senior front benchers attended. Their attendance was logged by one of the Corbyn offices, and one of the attendees was, of course, Sir Keir Starmer.
Yes, Yes, that's absolutely right. One of the things that sort of comes across a bit in the Margaret Hodge thing, of course, is that Jeremy Corbyn's response always was, well, I've been an anti-racist campaigner all my life. How can I be an anti-Semite?
I'm a good person. How could
Yeah.
I have done something wrong? I mean,
What?
it's kind of, I mean, most of us who've had children have at least one child who thinks like that. So it's fundamentally impossible for me to have created sin by the kind of the goodness of the kind of person I am. I'm an anti-racist. Anti-Semitism is racist, so therefore I can't be an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I would just say that, I mean, not being somebody who feels I can look into people's souls, I would accuse Jeremy Corbyn of having been incredibly careless about the repetition of anti-Semitic tropes rather than being an anti-Semite, and
Yeah.
of being much more too tolerant of actual anti-Semites and not seeing them coming when he should have done in a way that he would have done had it been about a different kind of racism. That's the way in which I would put it, which is a rather longer way round of going at it, but nevertheless feels to me more satisfactory. But the thing that she talks about there, and you're absolutely right to focus on it, is that there was also kind of this mixture of tetchiness and vacancy about Corbyn, which you notice when he's challenged. He's gone for year after year after year to meetings where he's been applauded by relatively small groups saying how wonderful you are, and he tells them how wonderful he is, and solidarity comrades, and goes off to the next one. And he's against everything that's bad and he's in favor of everything that's good. So he always gets applauded. And then if you see, I mean, we ended the program with the challenge that Piers Morgan, who is not somebody I admire, made to Jeremy Corbyn when he was on an interview with Len McCluskey just a couple of months ago.
Mm.
Um, uh,
You were
uh,
promoting a new book of poetry.
promoting, actually promoting old poems in a
Yes.
new anthology because they are Jeremy Corbyn's and Len McCluskey's favourite poems. And anybody who thinks that that's a profoundly missable experience, well, I'm of your camp. And though McCluskey has no difficulty in calling Hamas a terrorist organization, Corbyn cannot do it. He cannot say, this is after October the 7th and everything. He
Yeah.
cannot bring himself to do it and gets crosser and crosser and crosser and crosser. It's a deeply revealing moment about his, if you like, his kind of his inner self and what kind of prime minister that would have been had it ever come about.
All right, we're gonna come back in a bit to the anti-Semitism thing because I think it's an important part that Kat's already mentioned in terms of Starmer's leadership and what he's done to the party since he took over. Kat, the other really important moment, if you like, in Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was the whole Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, which I'm sure everyone will recall. Do you want to just take us through that? Because you were there in the lobby working in Westminster at the time, and it well, there were a couple of news lines anyway that you got, and it'd be worth going through those.
Yeah, so just the sort of potted history of what happened. Skripal was a double agent who had been living in England for some time, and he and his daughter were found slumped on a bench in Salisbury, and it transpired that they had suffered poisoning from a chemical later identified as Novichok. As well as them, policemen who found them, who went to their house, I think it was, got very sick with the same symptoms, and a woman sadly died, caught up in the whole thing because she had been given a perfume bottle that a boyfriend had found, and it was the vessel that the Novichok had been contained in. So she very sadly died. Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at the time, I think sort of really came into her own at this point. All of her sort of former Home Secretary training kind of came to the fore, and I think she dealt with the matter in a way which I think even most of her most ardent critics would say was right, was fair. She was very sober and somber when she was giving the statement to the House. She kind of led a kind of global push to expel Russian diplomats from the country. And Jeremy Corbyn's response was, I would say, equivocal. He talked about giving samples of the Novichok to the Russians so they could test it to see whether it was actually from them. He suggested that perhaps it might have been that maybe the poison had originated from the Russian state, but it might have fallen into the wrong hands. And you know, how do we really know? And there was a lot of confusion and concern from people in his own party. I remember Yvette Cooper, who at that point was on the back benches, very much outside the circle of trust, gave a very different response, gave the response that I think a lot of people felt should have been the response that the leader of the opposition gave, which was to be in solidarity with the government at the time. She wasn't alone. Lots of other Labour backbenchers did the same. And at that point, whenever there is a sort of big statement like that, often there will be what's called a huddle afterwards in one of the rooms immediately outside the chamber where the press sit, with the spokespeople for, you know, the government or in this case, the leader of the opposition. And so we're all gathered round, listening to the spokesman trying to explain what Corbyn was trying to sort of get across in the chamber, and of course being questioned. And these are the times when, you know, journalists are really trying to sort of get to the bottom of what can sometimes be sort of deliberately nuanced and slightly kind of vague language. And at this point, the spokesman, who was later identified, breaking all usual conventions, not to name the spokesman, it was Seamus Milne. I'm sure many people will remember that name. He made it clear that there was a real skepticism, if not cynicism, within the Corbyn camp about Western intelligence in general, and specifically on this point, and made the point that it had been wrong before, i.e. Iraq war era. And as I said earlier, that's when I think something really kind of clicked in my mind about the mindset of the people around Corbyn and Corbyn himself. And as David said, obviously there is this kind of longer running anti-imperialist strand, but that was sort of a more modern iteration of it, which was that the trust had sort of broken down so badly because of the Iraq war that people could not believe the intelligence agencies of their own country were telling them that it was a Russian state that was doing it. And so that's why he was named sort of breaking all of the conventions. And then that kind of led into this sort of new wave of concern from Labour MPs about what they were going to do about this leader who seemed so at odds with their values and the values of the country. And I think, although the names Skripal and Salisbury may have not been the sort of names that came up on the doorstep in 2019, we know that the damage that it did in Labour's standing on these issues of defence and patriotism, and still now it's sort of something which the party is sort of trying to claw back, which is why you see all the flags everywhere, and why you see this kind of very sort of softly approach in which they kind of back pretty much everything that the government has done, just to prove that they are not of the same breed as Corbyn and his team.
Something else important I think you discovered, though, Kat, was that Skripal was a really important moment for Keir Starmer as well. I mean, David was right that in a way Brexit was the escalator that was taking him to the top, but Skripal was the thing that sort of put him on it, if you like.
So as I say, several backbenchers were deeply uncomfortable with this turn of events, and one of them was Jenny Chapman, now Baroness Chapman. She was the MP for Darlington at the time, and she told us that she called Keir Starmer that weekend, the weekend after this statement, and said, "This can't go on." And she basically said, you know, would you consider standing as leader? And he said, yes, he would. And from then on, they had weekly meetings on the Monday morning. They all came down a sort of afternoon early. I mean, obviously, Starmer's not far because he lives in London himself. But usually MPs travel on Monday morning. She started to travel down on Sunday so that she was in London, so that they could have these Monday morning meetings in her house. It started out with a kind of small group of them, and they were discussing news and sort of responses and tactics, and it was a nascent leadership campaign that began in 2018, long before anyone had suspected that it was, and whilst Starmer was still serving in the shadow cabinet.
And then you've also got at the same time this sort of grouping of, I guess you would describe them as sort of centrist Labour MPs who were also organising under the banner of Labour Together, and they were sort of
Yes.
meeting outside Westminster. So really, by that stage, people were seeing a future beyond Corbyn, I think, weren't they?
So
They
Labour
were,
Together had been going for a while. I think it was originally set up in the immediate aftermath of the 2015 defeat, to try and understand what had happened, and then it sort of went underground and was rebranded as Labour Together. But we were told was kept deliberately buried so that the Corbynites wouldn't find out. And they would carry out polling. They would sort of they identified. Fairly early on that although because Corbyn had won 2 leadership contests with the membership, the sort of received wisdom was that he was very popular with the members. Actually, what their polling realised was that he was popular with a roughly 25% of the membership. There was another 25% that were more centrist. And those 2 positions were broadly fixed. And then there was a 50% sort of swing vote, which they referred to as the idealists. They were people who were politically naive, turned off by the sort of polished politicians that we'd had on both sides, but obviously particularly within Labour for several years, Ed Miliband being one of them, but not particularly strong ideologues. And so it was this group that Labour Together began to target. And what they did was they would sort of pilot selection process campaigns in order to sort of hone their technique to defeat the sort of Corbynite candidates, just so that they would get through that stage of the process past the membership to the more general electorate, and that is a sort of technique that I think they have gone on to use in some of the selection process for the upcoming election as well.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to just in the last sort of 15 minutes move forward a bit. Obviously, what happened then 2019, Johnson's there, he holds his election, he gets Brexit done. It's Labour's worst electoral defeat since maybe 1935. I'm thinking there's a date there somewhere. Starmer becomes the leader in the middle, right at the start of the pandemic. He becomes, his acceptance speech, he has to do it on Zoom. David, we're, nearly 4 years into that now. Give us a sort of scorecard, if you like.
Right. I think it's fair to say, certainly fair to say, that we didn't actually know who this person was when this whole thing started. I mean, as we make clear in the last programme, the prospectus that Keir Starmer sells to the Labour Party to get elected is, I'm a competent form of Jeremy Corbyn. Essentially, I believe most of the things that he believes are very kind of radical, etc. It's just that I know how to do stuff. And he puts out these things, these 10 pledges, which include things like kind of getting rid of student debt and stuff like that. And as one of the close Corbynites told Kat for the programme, we couldn't lay a glove on it. There we were trying to define this kind of big difference between ourselves and Starmer, and he wouldn't do it. So that was very frustrating for them. Their candidacy hasn't gone well. They've stuck up for Rebecca Long Bailey, who in retrospect, seems rather kind of disinclined to take the job, etc. But she's the Corbyn candidate.
Well, the suggestion was that she'd been sort of slightly kind of forced to do it by part of the party, I think.
Yeah, slightly kind of pushed. They had another candidate, Laura Pidcock, but she'd lost her seat. And if so, that's a real kind of Michael Portillo moment for those who want to go back to 1997. Because that explains why William Hague becomes Tory leader in 1997. But that really is excavating ancient history, and it's for another piece which actually I'm currently writing. So we don't know really who he is, and people keep saying we don't know who he is, we don't know what he stands for, blah blah blah, blah. And it's been fascinating watching the evolution of who this leader is. And if you were to take this week as the kind of paradigm, there's a Prime Minister's question time in which the Rwanda question is paramount. Or we can take another example. 2 weeks ago, there's Keir Starmer in Estonia with the British troops. I swear to you, he looked more like the British troops than they did. I mean, this was no kind of Boris Johnson and kind of some kind of ridiculous gear with all that kind of, hair sticking out everywhere, etc. He honestly looked as if he was the lieutenant colonel of the regiment in Estonia, and so on. And what we've gradually become to realize was, firstly, there are certain things that he felt had to be done. And when Keir Starmer thinks that something has to be done, then they're going to go and do it. And they're going to pay the price for getting it done. He didn't want, and I think one of the things that really is indicative of this is what's happened to Jeremy Corbyn. It was not Starmer's intention to throw Corbyn effectively out of the Labour Party once he'd taken over. He just wanted Corbyn to disappear. Then the Equalities Commission comes up with its report that's been commissioned during the Corbyn period into Labour's anti-Semitism, and effectively says, you've been a bad lot to the Jews and you'd better change your ways and say you're sorry. The official Labour Party line set out by Starmer is, we accept everything you have to say and we're very sorry. The line put out by Jeremy Corbyn before he even knows what Starmer has said is, yeah, well, I'm a tiny bit sorry, but actually it's all been exaggerated. Effectively, I paraphrase. To wit, which is not an acceptable position for a senior Labour person to hold as far as Keir Starmer's involved. Initially, the National Executive Committee says to Corbyn, you're going to be suspended for a bit. It's still a bit Corbynite at this point, the NEC. And Keir Starmer effectively says through the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is much more his to control, you're not going to have the whip with us. You're not going to sit as a Labour MP effectively in Parliament. That's a power we do have. And this position gradually becomes, as Corbyn refuses to apologise, effectively becomes, you're not going to actually be standing for us at the next election as a Labour candidate. And consequently, if you do, you will be expelled and everybody in the Labour Party who supports your candidacy will be expelled because them's the rules. And that's the position we're in at the moment. That position was got to by Starmer because those were the necessities of the situation. He was prepared to take the necessary decisions. And that tells you a lot about him as well, which is essentially he lays out a strategy and a position and a way of getting things done, works out how to do it, doesn't take much BS along the way in order to get it done, and is actually, you gradually begin to realize, an increasingly effective political performer. That's the truth. And actually, even if you might think his voice is a little bit kind of plaintive and whining, and even if he looks at you in that kind of way that you think is a sort of, a little bit too much slapped ass, like a slapped ass sometimes. Nevertheless, what you've got there is somebody who's effective and now increasingly confident about what he's got to do. And I do think that we've gone through an entire revolution in our attitudes and perceptions, those of us who've been looking at Keir Starmer, about who he is, which also gives us some background thinking back to who he always was, including when he was a Crown prosecutor at the CPS, etc., which is also quite an effective runner of things that he is given into his charge to run. I don't know what Kat thinks about that.
It's interesting, David. If you go back to it, in fact, if you go back to old archive interviews from when he was head of the CPS, he was much more open about his kind of family life or whatever it was than he has been as an MP. And he's definitely, you know, he's making every effort to keep his family apart from his job, I think.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Kat,
He's had to be sort of coaxed to open up as much as he has done. You know, it's been effectively because he is so led by data. I think it wasn't until he was given polls and focus groups and whatnot saying, look, this is how important it is for you to talk about your family, that he actually relented and started to do
but
it.
he still
But he
doesn't
doesn't, it doesn't come comfortable. No.
his children. He keeps his children out of the.
Who would have thought that somebody who was the Crown prosecutor would be evidence-led?
Yes.
So Kat, just quickly, David's sort of, I think, painting a picture of really quite a pragmatic leader.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, though, that might be keeping him awake at night is that, and if he's interested in data, is his personal poll ratings are probably, they're certainly not where Blair's were at this stage in 97. And he's polling, I think, behind the Labour Party more generally in terms of, you know, popularity and so far as any of these things matter.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is difficult. You know, at the end of the day, charisma is not something that you can learn or even, or you know, be taught. It's something that you either have or you don't have, and I think sometimes the sort of, you know, the problem is that sometimes politicians have it in spades in person, and it just loses its way in translation on the TV or radio or what have you. I think the speech that I saw him give at party conference was by far the best speech that I have seen him give. Not even because of the glitter bombing, which actually
This
I
was
know he
last
got
year, wasn't it? Last
audits for his response to that. I found it actually kind of more, you know, a bit stilted and a bit, you know, but you know, he dealt with it. It was fine, and it gave him the opportunity to take his jacket off and do the, you know, politician pushing their shirt sleeves thing up. I'm ready for work type thing. But for me, what I thought was great, and I'd love to know who wrote that speech, was the sort of way that he talked about, and again, I'm sure this has been focused group to high heaven, but was about the need for politics to tread lightly on people's shoulders, which is again something that he said in his speech earlier this year.
Yeah.
He used the phrase conserve, I think, about 3 times throughout the speech. So it's a canny speech. And of course, Securenomics, which is part of Rachel Reeves' pitch about trying to make people feel economically secure, given the last 18 months or so of the cost of living crisis. So I think they are very, very cautious. You know, when I was talking to sort of Labour aides and candidates and whatnot in the bar late at night, you know, no matter how much alcohol you throw down their throats, they didn't go off script. They would say they were, you know, cautious and not complacent was the kind of watchword. So there is a kind of iron discipline there, which I think comes not just from Keir Starmer, but Morgan McSweeney, who we haven't spoken about, but is a really kind of instrumental person in this whole project. So
just remind people who he is, Kat.
So he ran Starmer's leadership campaign. And he was the head of Labour Together, which was the group that kind of did all of this work, this kind of background work to really nail down what kind of candidate both members wanted and the wider public wanted. And now I think he's director of communications. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, sorry, director of campaign. Sorry, yeah. Campaign director. But you know, he's a very, very close part of Starmer's team. And you know, he has sort of associates that are in Starmer's team on a daily basis as well. So there is a kind of constant read through with both of these teams.
Yeah.
And I think that they are cautious, but it is a deliberate strategy, not just because they know that any gaps that they create between them and the Conservatives that are inadvertent gaps. They are increasingly coming up with new policy ideas that do create those gaps, but any inadvertent gaps will be used by the Tories as wedge issues to to undermine them, and as discussed, they're particularly sensitive around defence and the economy. But there is an active strategy of de-risking the Labour brand post Corbyn. So they have identified that there are some diehard Conservative voters who will never vote Labour. Doesn't matter what you do and how bad the Tories are, they will never vote Labour. But they might not vote at all.
Yeah.
And if you make Labour a sufficiently unrisky electoral vehicle, disillusioned Conservative voters may well sit this one out and see how it goes. And this is very similar to the playbook used in 1997 that Tony Blair was elected under. So although you cannot replicate the charisma and the charm and the sort of, kind of pop star feel that Tony Blair had, you can replicate some of the strategy, and that is what they're doing.
It's paradoxical, this one, because in 1996, I think the Tories recognised that Labour being seen as not being dangerous was precisely a problem. They'd used the idea of Labour actually being dangerous in 92 to great effect. So they created the demon eyes, famous demon eyes thing, which it was a new Labour, new danger, and so on. And Tony Blair with demon eyes and so on. And it was probably the most ridiculous single campaign. But you can see absolutely, given what Kat says, where that comes from, which is elections are composed of several different parts, and they're not always the ones that you're thinking about. Governing is a completely different matter.
But it's
Governing is a
completely that tactic, David, because the Conservatives are trying to portray Starmer as a risk, as a danger. They've got a new ad out, I think today, sort of modelling him as, if you're a terrorist, who are you going to call Keir Starmer? Better call Keir, based around Better Call Saul, sort of thing. So yeah, it's funny. It'll be interesting to see whether that works at all.
And Reform,
actually, I have to say
they
that
came up with Starmageddon.
Starmageddon. Well, that was that was Reform. I mean, I love Back to Square One. I just love that one because you've got millions of people in Britain thinking, yeah, I quite like Square One. Square One doesn't sound so, it wouldn't be so bad, Square One, thinking, kind of getting back to that. I mean, it is very difficult at the moment for people to frighten, for the Conservatives to frighten.
Well, in a way, it's left Labour don't have to do a great deal because the Conservatives are busy tearing themselves apart over, so many different issues. So that helps them, I guess. The final question I've got for both of you, because we're getting to 7:30, is what you think, or whether you think the left, Bennites, Corbynites, Corbynistas, Corbynites, whatever you want to call them, where do they go within the Labour Party? Because it's always been a broad church. There's always, Corbyn was at home in the Labour Party under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Neil Kinnock, and so on. Could they ever come back and take control of the party again, do you think, David? Or do you think they've gone?
The mechanisms still exist whereby they could. And in fact, they exist. What we now realise is that the giving over to memberships of the control of leadership has created a kind of series of risks. It's a bit like the kind of Republican primaries, if you like, a series of risks for political parties of effectively what you might call activist capture. Whereas when it was all done in the kind of lovely, dark, dusty things of just within Westminster, everybody knew who was supposed to be good and who was supposed to be bad. Their main orientation at that point would be to the voters, not to satisfying activists. Now the main thing that leadership has to do in the first instance is to satisfy the activists. And that's a really kind of distinct kind of position. So yes, of course they could. And I now realize, I mean, having been very naive about this myself, I think it's entirely possible. The next Labour government, when it comes in, as I think it will, probably in the autumn, faces a series of scarcity problems and long-term policy problems, which I think are relatively unparalleled. And under those circumstances, it's quite easy both for the populist right to get very, if only you'd throw all the immigrants out, etc., then wouldn't it be such a kind of much better place to be, etc. But also from sections of the left that say you're going so slowly that that the whole problem is you're not radical enough, etc. And there will be plenty of people who are takers for it. So I will never myself now get into a position of ruling out possibilities of really significant change that I used to think was unlikely. I don't think that anymore. So it could come back, but it won't come back in that way. It will be in a different way.
Yeah, Kat, what do you think, and also what do people in Westminster tell you about that, or what answers do they give you if you ask them about that?
I think we're so short-sighted in Westminster that we're not thinking that far ahead. But I agree with David. I would probably go a bit further. I think that pretty much everything is cyclical. So I think it's almost an inevitability that at some point there will be a sort of tilt back to the extremes. But for the time being, a lot of the people that we spoke to for this have gone in quite different ways. There are some that have gone green. They've resigned their Labour membership and gone green, or gone to even smaller independent parties. And they are purists, much like the sort of old guard of Labour left would be, that they want to they don't believe that pragmatism and compromise is the right approach. They believe that there is only one way to solve the problems as they see it, and it is their way, which is obviously quite a different to the sort of prevailing view at the top of Lotto at the minute. I've forgotten what I was going to say. Oh yes, but I think a lot of them have become a lot more vocal since October 7th.
Yeah.
And they are particularly critical of the fact that Starmer has aligned the party with the UK government in its response, and that has had some repercussions for Starmer. I don't think that it really does anything to significantly change the electoral prospects of the party. But I think there is.
If you talk to John Curtis, the polling there's negligible impact on the polling.
No, but there is certainly among Labour MPs that I've spoken to, there is an acceptance that there may well be a handful of, and it is a handful of Labour MPs who could lose their seats because of it. But in the main, what it will do is erode seats with a very high majority, because they tend to be in cities that are with students or higher Muslim populations, where Labour is the dominant party, and therefore it will maybe take a 34,000 seat majority down to a 30,000 seat majority, but it's not going to stop the sort of the Labour victory that people are expecting. And so so I think probably we'll see an extreme tilt on the right before we see an extreme tilt on the left. But I think it's probably inevitable that at some point people, because they look for alternatives to solve the problems that are never solved, perhaps because they can't be.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, Kat, thank you very much for taking part. David, thank you very much for your time. And thank you all for listening in. I hope you found it useful. If you haven't already, you can find 8 Years Hard Labour, our podcast series, wherever you get your podcasts, and do recommend it to your friends or your enemies, whoever you like. But thanks anyone very much for joining us.